So thanks a lot, Jackie, and thanks a lot to Digit as well for the opportunity to actually present this piece of work. So a little bit of context is that this piece of work, so it's co-authored between myself, Nona Maye, so Bruno as well, who's here, as well as Jan Rofli, all of whom are from Sciences Po Paris. And so basically this was a paper that was, and has been published actually in 2019, and it's part of a bigger special issue that Bruno has actually basically organized together with Thomas Kura. And it looks at the politics and the political consequences of technological change. So Bruno will probably talk a little bit about it, but I would sort of make references to it because it's sort of a part of bigger understanding of how I think, or we think at least, automation and technological change could potentially influence politics today. So I think sort of first thing that's kind of interesting is I know evidently that this talk was not timed to the entire thing about ChatGPT, but it's sort of interesting that given the fact that it was delayed, obviously this talk due to certain strikes that had occurred in the UK, but this is also sort of a timely thing to think about, right? So the sort of automation had gone down and then people were not talking as much a little bit about it, but now people are actually speaking a little bit more about it again with ChatGPT. So on one hand, some people think that ChatGPT could actually replace one's job, right? So it has a substitutive effect. On the other hand, and here's also sort of another slide, which could be interesting as well. It's sort of the opposite of the other so the flip side of this entire debate about automation as well as ChatGPT, that it could be actually a complement instead of a pure substitute. And over here is just an example of how 7 ways in which through which ChatGPT could actually increase sales. And so this was a pitch that was made by a company that was trying to show how, unlike this, ChatGPT could be something to enhance workers' productivity, or also in terms of, in terms of their tasks. But so moving aside from the entire ChatGPT, I think it was that earlier sort of, it's a way to prime the entire, conversation or thought about what technology and what automation does and what we should think about it in terms of its political consequences. Over here is basically a graph that sort of kickstarted the entire paper that was written here. And this is a graph that is basically that was done up by Frey and Osborne in 2018. And so this was a landmark piece back then. It's highly contested today, but in essence, its core argument is fairly simple. So this is based on projections of the US labor market in the future. And basically the arguments that the authors are trying to make is that there are 3 groups of occupations. On one hand, you have this low 33% of US jobs are basically at low risk of being automated. So that's or computerized. And 19% have medium risk and 47% have high risk. So basically when Frey and Osborne had basically published this paper, and these projections, it sort of kickstarted a lot of the debate also within labor economists on how bad or how susceptible or how much change there would be in the labor markets as a result of computerization and automation and so on and so forth. So on the other hand, what is also interesting is that if we take a slightly more retrospective picture, and so this is basically a table that is taken from Goose et al. In 2014, and it shows, while the previous slide showed you projections of change in the US labor market in 2050, over here what is shown is the change in employment shares of aggregate employment shares of different occupations from 1993 to 2010. And what's also interesting over here are basically 3 columns to be looked at. One is sort of the average employment share in 1993, then sort of the percentage point change from 1993 to 2010. And over here is RTI. So RTI is sort of another measure of automation risk, and that's sort of computed and first generated by David Alter and colleagues. And basically, it's called routine task intensity index for those whom are not familiar with it. And higher values indicate that a job is at greater risk of being automated. And what's obviously interesting is this middle block over here, is that jobs that have higher values of automation risk tend to also have seen basically a decline, an aggregate decline in terms of employment share in basically many Western European countries. So if you take the 2 things together, so this is the projection, and this is sort of based from 1993 to 2010, there seems to be a similar story that's coming up. Basically, the sort of bottom line is that automation might be harmful for certain occupations and potentially beneficial for others. So it substitutes some and complements others. So in that sense, that sort of spurred a lot of our thinking about, okay, so just wait a second, right? So would this actually affect politics? So a lot of it has been spoken about prior to this paper being published. More of it was labor economists talking within themselves, basically what is the distributive impact of automation and other sort of associated technologies in terms of aggregate employment. Less was done in terms of the politics, sort of the political consequences of it. And prior to this article and special issue, as I've said earlier, there was less focus on the political consequences of change induced by automation. And amongst the few back then, there were two that stood out. One was basically by Thomas Kura, that was published later on in 2020, but there was a draft very early on in 2017. And another one is basically by Stefan Davidson and David Reda, which explored the links between one's jobs being susceptible to automation and support for redistribution. So in that sense, we tried to fill a gap. We tried to fill a gap of basically that maybe, that automation could trigger some kind of political response. And for us, we thought that it was important to do some things. To take things into consideration. On one hand, the sort of graphs that are presented over here and the tables that are presented over here would suggest that basically what we should observe is that people whose jobs are affected by automation should basically have certain types of political behavior because they are worse economic, or they have suffered worse economic conditions. But on the other hand, there's something very interesting that was actually shown in two papers. So basically Thomas Kura in 2020, and also in the contribution to this special issue, the same special issue by Thomas Kura and Aina Gallego, where they basically showed that aggregate sort of changes at the aggregate level of employment shares mask a lot of what's going on that generates this decline. What actually happens is that these vulnerable routine occupations that are observed over here, in the sense that what has been declining over here, is actually not led by higher exit rates, so to speak, high unemployment. Rather, it's actually led by much lower entry rates. So fewer young workers or fewer workers actually entering these occupations. So to speak, these occupations are sort of hollowing out in that sense. So that forces, I guess, in a way, us to rethink a little bit about how does automation actually trigger political responses? The classic sort of political economy way would say that there's an unequal distribution of costs, right? And in the sense that these people in routine occupations that are vulnerable to automation, perhaps they are suffering from worse economic conditions. But what these two papers, so both Thomas Kura and it's in the other one with Thomas Kura and Aina Gallego have tried to show on the other hand, it's not so simple as that. It's not the fact that they are necessarily economically worse off. So then it becomes even more interesting to think what actually could then trigger political responses if there's this kind of change in the employment structure. For us, we try to posit two things. So the first thing is that perhaps what might be playing out instead, and if we assume that there might be, and that's what we want to test, if there's actually sort of a political response to automation, perhaps it's not so much about objectively worse economic conditions, since many of these people are still staying in their jobs, but perhaps it's a little bit more about subjective fears of decline. And this decline could come either in the form of economic decline later on, or it could be also in terms of social status. And we know from sociological research that people care about their social status, and occupations actually accord workers social status. So in that sense, how automation could actually generate or engender sort of political responses is through the threat of decline to vulnerable workers who are still in their jobs. And that's sort of the central argument that we're trying to make. So in that sense, where does that get us? So who would these people vote for in that sense? We sort of leverage the literature on economic globalization as a starting point. And we say that basically winners and losers of automation and technological change are probably likely to respond differently. And we would suggest that basically the losers of automation in this sense may react to perceived fears of decline by voting for radical rights. And the sort of reasons behind this is that prior research has shown that voters who fear decline often support radical right parties. So this is fairly established in the literature. And they do so because, or rather in the sense that why is it that these people often would support radical right parties? Because radical right parties are very effective in sort of using nostalgia to try to draw these people into believing that they would bring back the better past. And that's sort of a very effective way to get at people who fear decline, being economic decline or status decline. So that leads us to sort of our first hypothesis, which is that individuals who feel more threatened by automation, or sorry, individuals who are more threatened by automation are more likely to vote for the radical right. But we also make a second argument that we think that it's also important to consider within or amongst vulnerable workers, so amongst vulnerable workers workers who are vulnerable to automation. And amongst these vulnerable workers, perhaps it's economically secure, it's those who are economically secure who maybe have more to lose than workers who are already economically insecure. The logic behind this is fairly simple. If you're sort of already economically insecure, any sort of vulnerability might not actually add much. But for those who are standing at the precipice or who have not actually fallen yet, this sort of vulnerability actually matters even more, in the sense that you're still there, but you don't, and there's an actual fear that it might get worse, versus those who are economically insecure, things are already bad. It's perhaps hard to see how automation may make things even worse to trigger a response. So in that sense, our argument is that therefore perhaps workers who are vulnerable to automation may respond more strongly to fears of decline when they're still economically secure. So in that sense, it's this group of people who might actually vote more for radical right parties, which sort of sets up our second expectation, that basically automation threat increases the propensity to vote for the radical right amongst those individuals who perceive their economic situation as middling. So people who feel economically secure rather than those who are economically insecure. So moving on, I'm going to talk a little bit about the data and sample, how we actually tested our hypotheses. So in terms of data, we basically used the European Social Survey from round 6 to 8. So that covers the time span of 2012 to 2016. It's a biannual survey. We excluded earlier rounds because of different ISCO coding systems, so different ways that the occupational categories were coded, and that prevented us actually from assigning the automation risk values to respondents because of this difference in system. In terms of countries, we basically covered these following countries: Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, France, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and the UK. And the selection was based on two parameters. The first was basically data availability for the construction of the explanatory variable. And the second is that these countries have radical right parties with significant electoral success. In terms of the explanatory variable, we used the Arndt et al. Index. So I will talk a little bit about the slight differences between the Arndt et al. Index and the Freire and Osborne Index, which I showed earlier, and the reasons also why we prefer the Arndt et al. Index. So the Arndt et al. Index is basically based on an individual level survey data from the Program for the International Assessment of Adult Competencies. And it measures a comprehensive list of self-reported tasks that people actually perform in the workplace. And then individuals are first assigned an automation value or automatability value, primarily according to the sets of tasks, also the set of tasks that they perform, and secondarily according to their gender, education, competences, income, firm size, and sector. And this value also varies across countries. So what then actually happens is that we actually get a risk of automation for each occupational category measured at the 2-digit level at the ISCO occupational classification system, whereby the risk of automation for each occupational category is the mean of the automatability values of individuals belonging to the same category. So basically, it's provided by these economists, these labor economists, and basically it's the mean value. So each occupational category is the mean value of individuals who have been surveyed who fall within the same category, occupational category. So in terms of interpretation, higher values actually indicate greater risk from technological change. So this is sort of, before I move slightly further, I want to talk a little bit about the differences between the task-based approach, which is the Arndt et al. Index, and the occupation-based approach. There are essentially 3 ways to try to understand automation, and I'll cover that a little bit later on at the end of the presentation. Is that there's So there are three ways. The first way is to look at occupations themselves, which is basically what Frey and Osborne did. They asked experts to rate each occupation, whether they thought that the occupation would be vulnerable to automation, computerization, and other forms of technological change, versus a task-based approach, which resembles the more classic David Otto and colleagues paper that was published in 2003, where they're saying that what's important at the unit level by which automation is likely to affect jobs is at the task level rather than the occupation level. So what actually matters, or what this shows actually is that you get quite substantively different interpretations of results using these two approaches. So this is sourced from Arndt et al., where they projected and they showed the differences in these two approaches. The occupational approach, as you see over here, which is the dotted red line, as shown as basically is the Frey and Osborne index, and versus the task-based approach, which is the Arndt et al. Index. It basically shows that the number of occupations or the percentage of occupations is probably overestimated in the occupation-based approach in contrast to task-based approach. So in essence, the key takeaway for us, besides the fact that there are differences in unit level of analysis when these people are computing what is the level of automation risk, the key takeaway for us rather is that the task-based approach could be considered as a more conservative measure of automation risk rather than the occupation-based approach, which could be an overestimation rather. In terms of the moderator of economic security, basically we use the variable that proxies feelings of economic security based on their present household income. So a question that asks respondents how they felt about their economic security today. And it's basically a categorical variable of living comfortably, coping, difficult, and very difficult. And lastly, in terms of dependent variables, basically it's the party voted for in the last election, and we recorded it into 5 categories based on Jan and Alison Rafney's classification, which is basically vote for radical right, radical left, major right, and abstain. And then we also inserted a battery of socio-demographic controls. Lastly, in terms of analytical strategy, we basically use multinomial logarithm regression, and then we included design weights applied by the European Social Survey with country clustered standard errors and country year fixed effects. So fairly standard techniques that are used elsewhere. And basically we ran 2 models. The first model assesses the direct risk of automation, the direct effect of automation risk. And the second model where it's interacted with the moderator of economic security. So in terms of results, so this sort of first panel of results shows the direct relationship between automation risk and vote choice. So what's sort of interesting or what stands out is that there are 2 graphs over here. That these 2 graphs are probably the ones that are the most interesting, the top left and the bottom left. In terms of the top left, what you see is that as the risk of automation increases using the Arndt et al. Index, the probability of voting for radical right party increases. And what's also crucial is that this is statistically significant. By contrast, if we look over here in terms of the major right, as the risk of automation actually increases, support for basically center right or major right parties actually decrease. On the other hand, if we look on the right 2 panels, we don't see actually much of a significant relationship between risk of automation and center left voting, as well as with radical left voting. The next step we tried to consider was basically the moderating influence of economic security. Over here, the sort of most interesting thing that stems out is over here on the top left again, where we see once we disaggregate different types of automation vulnerable workers, over here we get a very interesting result. So what is shown over here is the average marginal effects of automation risk and on basically support on the probability of supporting for or voting for radical right parties for different categories of voters based on their economic security. What we see is that the average marginal effect of automation risk is only statistically significant for basically workers who feel comfortable on their present income or coping on their present income, versus by contrast is not significant for those who feel difficult or very difficult on their present income. On the right hand side for radical left, none of it basically shows that the average marginal effects of basically automation risk is not significant for all 4 categories of employment security. And in terms of major left, it's only amongst those that are very difficult. Basically, an increase in automation risk is correlated with a decrease in support for center-left parties, but only amongst those who find it very difficult today in terms of their present income. And lastly, for major right parties, for center-right, we see that an increase in automation risk is associated with a decrease in support for major right parts of center-right parties amongst those who feel comfortable today, who are coping and who find it difficult. But this is not significant for those who find it very difficult. And the last slide in terms of results tries to pan it out in terms of to illustrate what this actually means. So over here, I think this is the first one to look at, and which is the most interesting, is that, and I realized that maybe I should do this, so it's probably easier. Yeah, there we go. So this is probably easier to see. So if we look at this graph again, what is most interesting is that the group of voters which have the highest propensity of voting for radical right parties at high automation risk, as suggested in the earlier slide, is those who are coping. And the next one, and what you also see, there is an upward slope amongst those who find it comfortable. By contrast, you see a downward slope but non-significant slope for those who are finding it difficult or very difficult, which basically resembles what had been shown in the graph earlier. So the key thing over here is that if we're really talking about the one or the group of people which have the highest probability of voting for radical right party when there's a high risk of automation, is those who are not the most economically secure, but also not the ones who are the most economically insecure. Is those who are coping, so those who are economically secure, but there's a level of insecurity as well. So those who are in between. And then the other one that's interesting is over here in terms of major right. So it's basically a downward sloping for all, as suggested earlier, with the exception of basically those who find it very difficult. This was insignificant. And the last thing that's interesting is also abstention, that those who find it very difficult and those who find it difficult are much more likely to basically abstain at high risk of automation. So the key takeaways. Automation threat alone is linked to higher support for radical right parties, which supports our first hypothesis. At the same time, it's also correlated with lower support for center-right parties. Next, amongst automation vulnerable workers, support for radical right parties is most pronounced among those who are economically secure, which also sort of supports our second hypothesis, whereas abstention is most pronounced amongst those who are economically insecure, basically those who find it very difficult or difficult on present income. So in short, individuals who are coping on their current income are generally significantly affected by the increasing risk of automation, and this drives them towards the radical rights. And by contrast, this correlation is not observed for those who already find it difficult or very difficult to live on their current income. And in terms of a final slide, I think this is sort of interesting. I think it's interesting in the sense that this presentation is done on an article that was published in 2019. So I think that also offers us, it offers us a vantage point of saying placing the contribution of our work, and also where we think that where the future of the debate about automation and the politics of technological change, the political consequences of technological change should head towards. So basically, since this publication and special issue, there has been a burgeoning literature on the political consequences of automation. And what's also important is that the findings that we found here, that people who are more vulnerable to workers that are more vulnerable to automation tend to support radical right parties more. This is also replicated elsewhere in other studies which use other operationalizations of automation. And one that's interesting over here is sort of robot exposure, and that has been shown in Anelli et al. In 2022. But moving on, we think that there are 5 further areas for research based on our results and also the current state of the art. I think the first thing is sort of, especially with the rise of ChatGPT and all of this, perhaps it could be interesting to disaggregate between automation and digitalization. Specifically, if digitalization and automation affect different parts of the workforce, would it be possible that we might observe different results in terms of political consequences? I think the second is that there is still, so we tried to put forth one reason or a couple of reasons why is it that the threat of automation, of one's job being vulnerable to automation, could actually push a worker to vote for the radical right path. But having said that, our paper is pretty much about correlation. We don't identify any causal mechanism. So I think that the sort of next step that could be interesting over here would be to identify and isolate mechanisms linking automation threat to political behavior. And what's sort of interesting also is that recent research shows that individuals are often not very aware of their automation risk, or even if they are, they often misattribute their economic decline to other shocks. And typically, the most common shock that they attribute to are immigration or globalization. Additionally, on the supply side, I think it's worth thinking about why parties generally keep automation as a low salient issue or do not actually adopt clear positions on it. And could that be a reason why is it that workers whose jobs are vulnerable to automation often misattribute their economic decline to other shocks? So it's sort of the dynamic between supply, electoral supply and electoral demand. I think that nexus should be explored a little bit more. On the second last thing, perhaps it could be interesting to explore also political behavior beyond voting behavior towards other policy preferences. There's a fair bit of research that's coming out on this, but it's of course interesting to look at it further. And lastly, I think this is something that still is fairly underdeveloped, is that what is the role of social policy and other institutions in moderating the link between automation threat and political behavior? Right now, a lot of the literature tends to take automation threat as it is, and then also, putting it country fixed effects or variations of country adoption of robots, but without really looking at how institutions or differences in country institutions actually moderate this relationship between automation threat and political behavior. And with that, thank you very much for the opportunity to present this, and I look forward to all comments.
That's fantastic. Can you hear me now? Is that working? Yes. Okay, good. That was brilliant, Zhen. Thank you very much. Really, really interesting presentation. You know the drill, everybody. If you've got a question, if you want to put your hand up or put the question in the chat, and if you are able to turn your cameras on for this section, that would be brilliant. We're going to have about 5 minutes now for some questions before we hand over to hear from Bruno, and then at the end of the session there will also be some more time for questions. So I see Will has his hand up. So Will, do you want to jump in first?
Hi, thanks, Zhen. That's a really interesting presentation and some great research. I'm very interested in knowing a bit more about your analysis. So one of the things I wondered about is whether you had looked at the possibility or tried to control for any sort of external variables that might influence voting behavior and views on economic security. So, for example, although obviously you said you're not trying to claim a causal link, but could it be possible? It could be possible, for example, that the extent to which the answers to the questions about how comfortable they feel their economic position is could be influenced by, I don't know, their political ideology, which could also influence their voting behavior. So it could kind of work in the opposite direction, potentially, rather than just being a moderator between the risk of automation or their views of that and influencing the way they vote. It could be that there's something else that influences both the way they vote and how they feel about their economic security. So things like immigration, you sort of tend to see certain types of attitudes go together. So, people who maybe vote far right might be concerned about immigration, they might be concerned about their jobs, and all these sort of things linked together and are maybe partly influenced by the way they view the world, and which is informed by their kind of politics or ideology, if you like. So yeah, I wondered if there's any ways of trying to control for that or investigate that in your analysis.
How does this work, Rachel? Should I respond directly or should I collect comments?
I think, well, we just have the one, if you want to fire away with that one, just because, yeah, we can perhaps give people a bit more time at the end as well.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Will, for the comments. In general, so what we tried to, so basically we ran a series of robustness checks, and surprisingly, the results are quite robust, even when we control for attitudes towards immigrants, attitudes towards the EU, so economic and cultural attitudes, so, the typical left-right ideology, and also a sort of proxy for sociocultural attitude. So the results are quite robust, and we also control for income source and even things of basically industrial sector and the type of organization worked for. So surprisingly, it's a fairly robust result, which I think makes it even more interesting. So what is going on with these people, right? So I think what we tried to do and what we tried to lay out in this contribution to the special issue was that, could there be something? Could there be a link? And then I think the next step, as we would say, would be to sort of identify the link a little bit more clearly. We have some thoughts about what it might be, but of course, you know, it has, I mean, still something about something to be identified. But thanks for the comment.
Okay, can I ask Irina and Simon to put your questions to Zhen? And I think, yeah, that will do for now.
Okay, thanks very much. Really enjoyed the paper. Really interesting. What I wonder is what's happened to all the very poorly paid service sector jobs? Because to my mind, those are at pretty low risk of automation and they're low paid. So I would expect, even taking into account the disproportionately done by women, I would expect people doing low paid service sector jobs to be struggling to get by. Do they seriously expect, say, childcare and elder care to be done by machines very shortly, so that their expectations are unrealistic? Or is there some other explanation, you know?
Should I respond to this, Rachel? Or should
Simon, do you want to put your question now? We'll take these two and then we'll move on to Bruno after you've answered.
Yeah, no, thank you very much for the presentation. Very interesting. I think you mentioned right at the end institutions. I'm not sure they appeared in your slides or your analysis. And I wondered if you could control for the degree to which worker voice is protected legally or institutionally across countries, because I would expect that to affect attitudes towards trust in technology. And there are quite significant variations across countries, in Europe in particular, to do with co-determination rules and how they work, and the extent of worker participation in enterprise level co-management of the introduction of technology. I mean, it might have no impact, but one would expect it to have some impact, I think, at least a priori.
So thank you a lot for both comments. I will sort of answer both in turn. So in terms of the first set of comments of what happened to poorly paid service sector jobs, I think that's a very interesting point. I think it's also something that this paper does not capture. Because I think one of the main things that Goose and all in their paper was saying that, look, on one hand, with the wake of automation, middle class jobs and these kind of middle sector jobs, I mean, sort of, yeah, middle class jobs essentially are sort of basically declining relatively to the others, right? And then on the other hand, there's a growth of poorly paid often service sector jobs, lower service sector jobs. And then you also have the higher educated, high paying jobs. I think what's interesting on your hand, so we don't touch on this because by nature, these jobs tend to be at low risk of being automated. But I think what's important is to take stock perhaps of a piece of writing that was published, I think, last year by Jane Gingrich and Alexander Kuo, where they tried to look at the gender dimension or the gender component in lower service sector jobs, and how they said that automation is not necessarily always a bad thing for women, as it may, so in the sense that automation might lead to differential political responses due to the nature of jobs that men and women often find themselves in. So I mean, it's sort of I don't have a direct response to your question, but I guess what I'm trying to say over here is that it's something definitely worth investigating in the future. And also, of course, the interesting thing is that it seems that some types of lower paid service sector jobs today are also increasingly being automated. So I think it's a very fast and effectively, it's just a field that's changing and evolving very quickly, which sort of goes back to one of the points. I think it's very important to disaggregate the different types of technologies when we really want to look at the different effects that are going on. In terms of the second point, I think that this is very important. I agree. I think institutions should be looked at more. I don't actually have, and I agree with you, I think a priori sort of worker participation is very important. It probably would influence, and that sort of pinpoints the firm level variation. I think it's two things, right? It's institutional and it's also firm level variation. I don't have a, so we can't really test for it in this paper. At best, we actually put in country and year fixed effects, which don't do much because obviously they absorb for everything. But anecdotally, what I can say is that there is a very interesting article that is by one of my colleagues, Anna Wellman Brown, and she looks at how basically the impact of automation on wages and employment opportunities vary substantially in Ohio for big firms and small firms. And for small firms, it's a complement. For big firms, it's often a substitute. And it's a complement for small firms because there's a severe labor market shortage in the US. I mean, she looks at skilled welders. So it's a very specific niche area, but in theory, skilled welders should be automatable. But the fact that because they lack skilled welders in many small enterprises, they actually use automation as a complement to free up tasks so that these people can actually move up, so to speak, the ladder, right? Sort of so it's a very interesting dynamic and definitely something that's worth exploring in the future. So thank you to both for these great comments.
Jackie, I see you've got your hand up. Have you got a connection at the moment? Can you hear us at all? I'm wondering, because Bruno also wants to answer this question, if perhaps we hand over at this point to Bruno and hear from you, and then perhaps Jackie can put that question about what Labour can learn from this for the next election, which is quite a biggie, after we've heard from Bruno, all about class and what digitalisation means now in terms of class divisions. So Bruno, over to you. And thanks so much, Zhen.
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation. I was really pleased to hear Zhen presenting our work so well. And let me start with saying that my presentation is of a very different kind than the one Zhen did. My presentation is much more conjecture about what's going on with much less science and data analysis. But it draws a lot on what we've done together on the, let me call them now, the losers of automation, or the lower middle class, more generally speaking. So I will put my slide, and having warned about the fact that this is really much less data-based, but more conjecture. The second point I should start with is to say that sometimes we researchers try to understand differences, and there was one question about Zhen, about the differences, and sometimes we want to understand big trends. And I would say that Zhen, Jan, Nona, and myself, we wanted to show one big trend is that in general, these people who are threatened are more likely to vote for radical right-wing parties. And my presentation is also about potentially big trends. Okay, so what I'd like to do is to speak about class, and here again I should be specific, even though it will be rather vague what I would say, but I would specifically mention that I have more a notion of class in terms of class relations. So if you wish, a Marxian view of class, who dominates whom, rather than an analytical one, which tries to describe properly and differentiate between many classes. So what I will be speaking is really not Mike Savage language, if you wish, or Danielish language about the new class of the knowledge economy, but much more the class recomposition and interaction that we may be looking at. And I spoke about Marxian. I could also speak about Orwell, who, in his 1994 inner book, the kind of political theory that they all read about, he says that there are always three classes in a society: the high, the middle, and the low. The high wanted to remain, the middle wanted to take the place of the high, and the low to be the only one to be egalitarian, but always losing. And inspired by that or any other things, I think that we may wonder what are the three classes in the knowledge-based economy or digital era or 21st century. as you want. And for that, I will look at what I call the three main groupings of classes, if you wish, in the digital era. One is the losing one, the one we just spoke about, but more generally, I think they lose out of automation, but they've lost also a lot out of globalization. They are losing a lot about, and they will lose a lot about climate change and environmental policies. Basically, these are the same group of people, the losers, the big losers. And as Zhen said, they have something to lose because this middle was the center of our societies from the 40th era to, let's say, the end of the 20th century. And this is why I try to describe their reaction with Thomas Kuhrer and saying they are shrinking, but they are shouting, and they don't let it go passively. They don't accept their fate, their declining fate. And especially because they were central, they were insiders, they were voters, and they are not letting it go and trying to find a voice that will be speaking about them. And I will here tackle Jackie's preoccupation about labor. Then I'd like to speak about the low, who are now the low class, the proletariat, if you wish, in the service economy, in the digital era. And this is much more the low-paid services that was alluded to in the question previously. And I call them to try to figure out the way they are treated, the servants of the new economy. They are at the service of others, children, elderly, whether they are carer, but also whether they are driver or whether they build others' house, etc. And they are the winners, because we sometimes forget that if they are losers, they are also winners, and the winners are what I call the new educated middle class. The new owners of capital, if you wish, are those who own human capital. And I'm afraid to say that in front of the screen today, we are all partly winners of the new era. What I call the brains, to show that the nature of capital in capitalism has changed, because those who own labeled human capital, and I know here Jackie leave me and get cross because I let people believe that the servants have no brain. That's not the point. In our society, the dominants, they have labeled brains by universities. You have human capital. I say you have one, and of course servants have brain, but it's not acknowledged, it's not recognized, it's not paid. As simply as that. We know about the ethic of care, for instance. So this is basically what I'd like to speak a little bit about, and a few minutes left. So as you can guess, this vision of the society is very much inspired by the notion of the polarization of the labor market. Here, this is the representation by Otto et al. About what happened in the labor market, and Zhen mentioned that. And what happened in the labor market is that the big middle has started to shrink a little bit. Actually, this is only a representation of change, and the change occurs here. You have less jobs in the middle, more jobs here, and more jobs here. If we look at absolute terms, the middle is still the biggest chunk, but the shrinking is happening there. And this creates new divides in society. That's basically my point. And the point is that there is one divide, which is between the middle and the very low ones. And this divide is about, let's say, fear and jealousy. A lot of people who are here, just above, as we say in social policy, too rich to receive the means-tested benefit, but too poor to be living really well. And as we know, a lot of radical right parties are playing the jealousy. They say you work hard and you get nothing from the welfare state. They don't work, they are lazy, they are welfare queen, they are migrants, etc. I'm not saying this is true. I'm just saying that the political supply is creating a divide here, whereas you could have a continuum. But this creates divides and perhaps a different class. And here what you have in this representation is the emerging new educated middle class up to the very high ones, which is on the rise. You see that now between 20 and 40% of the active population is having a relatively high tertiary education level or vocational level in Germany, and they have pretty good pay, and they are on the rise, but they are not in the same middle, if you wish, as this one, especially because this one is going down, this one is going up. So that's basically the divide that comes, to my view, from polarization. And as you can guess, this is a very different dynamic from the one of the Fordist era, where you have a kind of concentration on the middle. You know, you have the expansion of the middle class at the expense, and this was a good news from the industrial proletariat, but also at the expense of the dominant former bourgeoisie. Now we don't have that. You have the shrinking of the middle. Of course, if you have questions, this trend is differentiated. You have many, many studies showing that you have polarization. Polarization is a decrease in the middle and an increase on the high skill, high pay side, and sometimes also an increase on the low pay side, but sometimes not. But you have differentiation. But still you have this polarization and tripartition almost everywhere. That's another representation published in Socioeconomic Review, but you still see a rise on the right-hand side, so the high skill, high pay, decrease or stagnation in the middle, and sometimes increase or not on the low paid jobs. You will mention that I noticed that I never said low skill people for those working in the low paid services, not to reiterate the idea that they would have no skill nor no brain. It's just that it's not acknowledged nor paid in our labor market societies. And this is what we have published in the special issue, again, showing that you have polarization, not the same amplitude, not exactly the same amplitude, but you have this common trend. And this is what we published with Thomas Kohler, is that if we bring many measures, we see a global trend, a decrease in the middle routine-based jobs, an increase on the low-paid service jobs, and an increase in the high-paid human capital jobs. Of course, we can say that the differences are explained a lot by institution and policies, and technology is just one dynamic which is filtered by institution. I will not develop that. This is a lot already written in this book about the filters towards the development of these trends. This graph is here to remind us that the size of the middle is still the biggest one. This is Louis Chauvel measuring the change between the 80s and the 2010s about the size of each income group in society. And you see that this is in the 80s, this is into the 10s, and you see here the gap because it replicates here, this line here. You see the shrinking is in the middle, but the size of the middle is still the biggest one. Okay, basically what I want to say is that there is a common trend though, and the old middle class, the lower middle class is shrinking and shouting. And they are afraid of being replaced by jobs and to be left over. And I, of course, choose one example, which is the Yellow Jacket movement in France, which to my view is one appearance of this protestation. We could speak about the current movement against the pension reforms too. Basically, these are people who work. If you look at their pay, it's not the lowest one. If you look at their situation, they may have a permanent contract, they may own their house, etc., but they feel threatened by the economic development, which is threatening the longevity of their jobs, threatening their way of life. They have more financial difficulties than before. Their children will not have the same opportunities. So this is basically the threatened aspect, which matter a lot here to create a common sense. And this is what we say with Thomas Kohler in the same special issue that Jen was referring to. We basically say that there is a kind of electoral revolt of this shrinking lower middle class. Those that in social policy we call the just above. Just to remind you that we are not the only one. A lot of politicians have detected that there is a electoral niche here. This is the jam in Theresa May's vocabulary when she addressed those who voted more for Brexit than others. You know that people have shown that typically this lower middle class is the one who voted for Brexit more than others. The just above, so not rich enough to benefit from means tested. In Yellow Jacket movement in French, they were speaking about themselves as those who have les fins de mois difficiles, so difficulties at the end of the month, and they contrasted then their situation with the preoccupation about the end of the world, and they said, sorry, but we have more urgent issues about paying for our gasoline than preserving the world. And as I said, they are threatened also by the environmental policies. If you think of this lower middle class, they are more likely than others to work in a carbonated industry, to live in a house that requires some renovation, but don't have the means to do that, that are supposed to take public transportation, but there is no buses or no working train around them, etc., etc. So they are threatened of losing their jobs, being forced to accept low-paid jobs currently occupied by migrants and women, and this for a lot of them would be humiliation. So they are threatened by displacement or déclassement, we say in French. So these people, to our view, are a potential reservoir vote for the radical right, and in majoritarian system like the US and UK for the right, which becomes more radical with Trump, or with Johnson and Brexiters. And in France, we could discuss about that also. So data have shown, and these are comments on the data that Zhen just showed, that I will go faster. And these are the conclusions that we draw together that Zhen very aptly presented them. So I will not develop that. But basically, you got the message. These threatened people, they don't hear any political supply in the centrist parties, and they are voting for the radical right. I guess you may have question about why they don't vote for the radical left, and we'll come back on that in the Q&A. And these are then, you know, if you look at Brexit, Trump, I could speak of all the radical right parties in continental Europe to mention that they are now installed as an electoral niche that these parties are cultivating, and that other ones try to attract. Think of the Danish Social Democrats, for instance, and these kind of things. We can speak about it. These workers are threatened and vote radical rights, and they are key and have been under the radar for years, and especially for the left. That's the beginning of my answer to Jackie's question.
You have about 10 minutes, Bruno.
Yes, thank you very much. So but there is another class, which is a new proletariat, which is also under the radar, or has been for long under the radar, because there has been confusion about who are the workers, who is the working class, who are the most exploited in capitalism. And I think that there is a strong legacy about thinking these are the blue workers, the one in the manufacturing industry, Charlie Chaplin playing a big role in our representation, and leading us to miss the point that there are new proletariat, new exploited people, more women than men, as was already mentioned in the question. Those I call the servants, with a lot of quotation marks, to mean, once again, that this is to try to characterize their exploited position in our service-based economies and knowledge-based economies. And what I find interesting is that of course, there is one literature who speak about these people. It's the labor market economist, but they speak with no shame about these people in terms of low paid sometimes, but usually they speak about the unskilled or non-productive jobs. You know, they say those ones that we see rising in the US and UK, in France, who have the lowest pay, actually they are either unskilled or low-skilled jobs or non-productive jobs. That's the way they are called. And in a way, this is the way it is legitimizing the fact that they are less paid than others, because supposedly they have no skill and they are not very productive. Therefore, they shouldn't be paid much. And of course, we can discuss that, because First, let us characterize who they are. There are more and more people working in interpersonal, face-to-face jobs whose development is partly linked to intermediation platforms. You can think of logistics, Amazon, Deliveroo, etc., transportation, Uber, restaurants, hotels, bookings, TripAdvisor contributing to retail and hotels, home helpers, personal services, carers, at least the private ones are being developed by platform. But you have, of course, a lot in private or public services for daycare, childcare, elderly care. And some economists even add people working in education and health as non-productive and not so well-paid people. These jobs are associated with low pay. And if you look at all the ones I just mentioned, many are in bogus self-employment. You know, this new status that has been created, for instance, by Uber or Deliveroo. They have otherwise short-term contracts, part-time work, and very low social protection. So they are really the proletariat. And there is here a paradox, because not only they are not well situated in the labor market, but the social protection system is not protecting or compensating well. On the contrary, providing under protection. So here we have a paper by Camille Penier, who's showing that these people are really, those who are here are also the ones who have non-chosen short-term time. They would like to work more and badly protected. Okay, so these are the people who have been studied also by labor market economists, and I'm here relying on a study made by 3 French economists on the labor market polarization in France, and they show, as you've seen for auto in the US, that you have between 1990 and 2012 an increase in the well-paid, supposedly skilled workers, decline in the middle, and some rise in the low part of the labor market. What is interesting in their study is that they look at who is paid the lowest in France, and we have here the profession, and these are assistant maternelle, this is nannies, if you wish, family workers, nurses, self-service workers, nursing aides, restaurant waiters, domestic workers. These are the kind of jobs that have developed more than others. And as we know, the first point to be made is that these jobs are supposed to be low skilled because they are relying on care activities. And we know from feminist works that care activities, the ethic of care, has been downplayed, undervalued as being genuinely natural, as if there was no skill behind them. So inferior feminine skill, attention to others, relational quality, degraded by the qualification of unskilled jobs. That's the first thing that happened to them to be devalorized, deconsidered, even though you developed a lot of them and we need them. I will come back on that. These are the jobs, the numbers of jobs that are growing in the low-pay sector and that are vanishing. And you really see here, this is much more industrial men's work and that are decreasing. And those who are increasing are much more care, service to others, women's work in France. But this is, we can, I think, generalize this kind of trend. Why are they so badly paid? And I think that to put it in a nutshell, it's first the role of patriarchy, where men disqualify the activities run by women, but also economic science has proven, so-called proven, that they are not productive, but also policies, public policies are contributing to the low pay of these jobs. So, as I said, these tasks are mostly performed by women. The feminist scholars have shown reproduction work as contrasted with the production one. A lot of them were unpaid work before, invisibilized and naturalized, and we know the process lead to disqualification and low paid once they are entering the formal labor market. But you have a second thing, which is Beaumont. Beaumont has made a theory which says that these services, interpersonal services, are not susceptible of productivity gains, perhaps the story of the chamber orchestra and these kind of things. There is a cost disease here, and they cannot be productive. Therefore, they shouldn't be paid much because they don't deserve it, and under the labor market laws. And so this creates a strong scientific argument against them to be paid more than their productivity. That, by the way, we don't know really well how to measure. The third element is that there has been a lot of action and policies aimed at cheapening their costs. Actually, if you look at, and this is what I've written with Cassie Thielen now 13 years ago, first you have outsourcing. All these jobs as services have been outsourced of our central firms so that they cost less. And of course, the way you make them cost less is to make sure that they don't get too good social protection, too many advantage, etc., so that they can be cheap for the firms who buy these services. You have also a lot of job creation, especially in continental Europe, via liberalization of the labor market. Think of the Hartz reform in Germany, the Macron ordinance in France, and many others. You liberalize the labor market so that the competition in these jobs make them as cheap and as less protected as possible. And then you have what is true, especially for France and Germany, a competitiveness strategy. You try to create a cheap environment for the productive ones, the so-called sheltered, non-sheltered sectors, and you try to make the services as cheap as possible. The say is that if the hairdresser is not expensive, then the general wage moderation is accepted by the core producers. So this is really a German or French strategy in a way. All these contribute to make these jobs as cheap as possible. So here you see the mechanisms. Let me finish on the third class, the brains one. This is basically the pyramid of pay and status within the digital economy made by Martin Kinney and et al. Just a reminder that if you look at Forbes now for the last 10 years, you have the digital firms or the services on the top. It's not manufacturing industry or oil, which make the richest one, except this one for this one. And you have the middle class, the educated middle class, which is following and trying to catch up in that. There has been a lot of studies on them too. This new ruling class, these are the Macron's voters. These are the Remains in UK. They live in urban centers, in megalopoles. Patrick Le Gallès has been working on that. Hirsch identified them. Hauserman has shown these are the core voters of the socialist liberal parties in the 2000s at least. Iversen and Soskis in their last book called them M, the median voter, not totally median actually, but these are the ones, and you see they are on the rise everywhere in all section of regions of our world. This comes from the WOPSI books I can speak about later on. And to finish and to conclude, it seems to me that in this service economy, knowledge economy, we have a strong class cleavage. If you think of capital and labor, now it's between brain and servants. That's basically where the new divide, to my view, lies between those who own the human capital rather than the private means of production, and those who have some but are exploited and denied to have any skill. One of the reasons I use this word is because it sounds in French, les cerveaux et les servants. And what is their relationship? I think what is their relationship is quite interesting to look through the lens of labor market economists once again. What do labor market economists say about the low-paid people? This is a quote of the 3 French economists that I mentioned who studied the labor market polarization. This is the translation of it. And they say the profound polarization of the labor market has led to a sharp rise in wage inequality. And this is true. We have more wage inequality everywhere, but they say it's because of technology, it's because of polarization. Low-skilled jobs in personal services, catering, logistics, health, are by nature, do they say, tasks in which productivity is low. Beaumont is here. Those who have had to move into such jobs are paid less than was usual in the skill manual and clerical jobs they held before. Here you understand why they are not happy, those lower middle class, if they have to accept less well-paid jobs, less recognized, they will not be very happy. But these economies, they say they have to, there is no chance, there is no jobs there, so you have to go down. Conversely, and this is what I think is really interesting, managerial and creative occupations have seen their productivity increased by the possibilities of IT, so technologies, new technologies, and the remuneration of such jobs has increased relative to the median wage. So it's all thanks to technology that these things happen, and this is natural and normal. What is quite interesting is that if you look at their study, who do they put at the top of those who earn the most? Themselves, chargé d'études économiques. It means economist, basically, in French. So it is quite interesting to see their own interest in there. But behind the polarization of the labor market, to my view, emerges a new social polarization. On the one hand, an internationalized creative class with global connections living in the heart of global urban centers, and on the other hand, a class of people at their service to take care of their children, to take care for them, to when they're old, for instance, to serve them in restaurants, to transport them, to build or renovate their homes, to educate their children, to provide healthcare to them and elderly care for their frail parents. A new form of social domination of brains as servants, a relationship of domination typical of a knowledge-based economy. And what I would like to say is that it's a different domination from the manufacturing industry one. This relationship of domination is less based on the ownership of the means of production than on the possession of human capital, at least the labelized one, knowledge and creativity. This has been very visible during the lockdown. If you think of it, I will pass that, but what you had during the lockdown, you had the three classes, basically those who could stay home and work, telework, those who had the human capital, those who had to stop working in the manufacturing industry, and those who had to go out and work, which is very much the one in personal services. At the time, during the lockdown, they were perceived as essential, first-line workers, but if you look at their situation on the labor market, it hasn't improved. It's still very low paid, not acknowledged, and not well protected. So these new servants enable the brain to concentrate on their task, not wasting time to subaltern tasks of care, of shopping, of transportation, and thus increase their productivity. These low-paid jobs are thus a necessary condition for the increased productivity of the brains, but only the brain get the remuneration of this productivity gain. This is what Marx has called exploitation. Why not sharing would be my last word, and then I leave the floor to the Q&A. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much for that. That was fantastic. I mean, having heard about the political consequences of automation in Zhen's work, it was really interesting to hear that class dimension development, what that means in terms of how we value productivity and the gender impacts, and how the brains are increasingly getting the rewards, those at the top with the tech skills and the know-how, and alongside seeing that kind of hollowing out of middle jobs and kind of centrist politics, and the impacts of digitalization on those with less recognized or valued skills. So I want to bring you back to Jackie's question, really, to then think about how political parties are targeting messages related to digitalization and also automation, and what can Labour perhaps learn from this for the next election. And then I would invite others to perhaps put your hands up, put your questions in the chat, and if you are able to, please do turn your cameras on.
So do you mean that I should start with trying to address Jackie's question?
Yes, yeah, well, people have a chance to have a think and put some questions down. That would be great. Thank you.
Okay, so what I think, Jackie, is the first message is that the left, Labour, but also the socialists, and should stop denying the existence of a shouting lower middle class. That's the first thing, and they have been really absent. Basically, the calculation of the new Labour, Tony Blair, but Clinton before, and let's say Schroeder after, has been the working class is vanishing, is disappearing. So we have to move to a new constituency, and this will be the new educated middle class. And by doing that, they just forget that they are shrinking, but they are not vanishing in the first place. And this is also forgetting about the new proletariat, the new service proletariat. So, and you cannot win election with only the new educated middle class. Basically, that would be my message. The problem is how to speak about this and to speak to these classes. What I find interesting is that in a time of individualization of politics, you merely have catch-all parties. So the idea is that you cannot have a class-based party, but you have to have a strategy that speaks to all these classes. And if I'm saying that, is because the radical right or the populist right is able to do that. Think of the strange bedfellow coalition that Trump has built. Trump can have the billionaires, the very rich ones, promising tax cuts. He can have, in a way, the lower middle class, both on their religious side, the Tea Party, and on the "you, my people, rednecks, I know that you exist and I speak to you," you know, the Rust Belt. Trump was speaking about that. So he has three classes, right? He has three groupings. He has the religious one, promising the Supreme Court, the tax cuts, the very rich, and the rednecks, to put it bluntly. Why not trying to have a coalition of chunks and sections of the three classes for the left? So the educated middle class is already there. Basically, it's us, right? It's academics, it's intellectuals, etc. And you have that on cultural issues, etc. You may have, in some countries, at least the radical left achieved that, to have some of this service-based class. In France, for instance, LFI, the extreme right, is able to attract them, but they totally miss the lower middle class. One of the issues I have with, I'm not speaking about the labor here, but I'm speaking about the left in general in Europe, is that they don't know how to speak to the lower middle class by other ways than just speaking to their right-wing ear. If you think of Manuel Valls, if you know this guy in France, or if you think of the Danish Social Democrats, they speak racism, they speak protectionism. So they speak the same language as the radical right to try to attract the same people from their radical right ear. But if you think of it, these very same people, they have issues which are social, who are left. They have problems with their jobs. They have problem of income. They have problem of physical damage. You very well know that the opioid pandemia map in the US is the same as the voting map for Trump. So why not trying to speak to them with their left ear? You have difficulties, social difficulties, your children have, you have health problems. So you need our welfare state, you need these kind of things. And we are not obliged to play their jealousy. We are not obliged to play their racism. We can play the left side. This would contribute to overcome the divide between the low and the middle that I mentioned, rather than play the jealousy. You work, they don't, etc. No, you have the same kind of problems, and we should work together. So this is utopian, this is fantasy, but the question by Jackie was leading to this kind of answer. That would be my point, is trying to find a left language to the educated middle class, but we know how to speak to us. You know, it's all about cultural issues, how to just recognize and promise betterness to the exploited ones today, you know, better wage, better social protection, and acknowledge the difficulties of the lower middle class. But Jen, you want to complement things?
Yeah.
Yeah, please do jump in. Yes, please do.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to add as well. I think Bruno has a spot-on point about this, because so if you think that in Finland is where it's fairly egalitarian, one of the Nordic welfare states, but you observe the same thing. You observe the same thing, being that lots of these people who actually vote for the radical right are not people who are per se in economic decline. Neither has their status declined, but they expect their status to worsen over time. And that's why that's all even more important to actually recognize what is the social value behind their work. And that's something that Bruno had been touching upon as well. And also at the same time, sort of not denying their existence and say, what's coming out a lot that's coming from the center left. I mean, the classic notion of what Bruno has been saying is also echoed in some other research about the Brahmin left and the merchant right? That we focus excessively on the interests and views of the educated left, and often forgetting what the people are in these other places that used to vote for the left. I think that's also a very important thing. And that also ties in a little bit to the sort of the geographical disparities, both in terms of economic opportunities, social status opportunities, and therefore voting behavior, sort of different disparities, right? And that's what sort of Rodriguez Post used to say about the places that the elsewhere, right, that voted for Brexit. But it's also the same notion that's over here. These are anywhere other than London is considered, or these key urban centers are considered places that have to be forgotten. And I think that's a message that the left has to come back to, I think. I mean, again, very utopian, but
If I may bring digitalization back into the story, we know from economic geographers that digitalization paradoxically has emphasized and accelerated aggregation of economic activities. We know that San Francisco, New York, London, etc. Digitalization, when we thought could spread work everywhere because you can telework, actually this is really not what happened, and this makes these places very expensive only for the top educated one, and this also create a class belongings and segregation, and this is just to jump on the geography that Zhen was mentioning, but let us not forget that digitalization technologies contribute to this geographic aggregation actually.
Yeah, I really like that idea about speaking to the left ear, but also to recognise that piece in your work, Zhen, about disengagement and disinterest and distrust, and how perhaps you can kind of pick up on that message as well to stop people from completely sort of losing touch or feeling that they have any kind of say or choice and ability to make a difference. I'll bring Felix in now. Felix, if you'd like to ask your question, please fire away.
I have two questions to each speaker. First, to Zhen, you talked a lot about the perception of people, whether they actually feel there is a threat. And as you highlighted, that was, I think, one of the limitations of your research, that you did actually not measure this. So I was wondering whether you try to triangulate what you found with some other surveys, such as the Eurobarometer, which I think they have attitudes to robots, they have attitudes to digitalization. There are, I think, some papers, for instance, by Anna Salomon, who wrote the piece on labor market polarization with Roos and Manning together, whether you try to figure out whether these people that you identified as being a threat and more likely to vote for the right are actually the ones that fearing robots and automation. And as a second point, if we take this individual level finding that you have to the macro level, have you found tendencies, similar tendencies? Do we see countries with more labor market polarization, since this is kind of the hook that you have, experiencing more trends to the far right? And then to Bruno, to pick up on this notion of inequality that you talked about in class, I was wondering whether you considered the role of labor unions. If we look at the rise in inequality, 2/3 is from actually between firm variations, 1/3 comes from within firm inequality that has been generated. New technology firms are less likely to be unionized, union left power. We have this massive concentration in non-unionized workplaces, which I guess also, why should we trust unions since they don't have any power left? What kind of role do you attach to them? Thank you.
Then
should I go first? Or Bruno, would you like to go first?
No, go ahead.
Go ahead, Zhen.
So thanks, Felix, for this comment. I think the first thing is so we use an objective measure of risk. And what has happened, I think, in recent research that has shown that actually many people whose jobs are actually vulnerable to automation, they don't think that their jobs are at risk of automation, surprisingly, right? One issue is because it's a low salience issue. People often are not aware of it. And the quite ironic thing is that people don't think that their jobs are at risk of being automated, but they think the other person's job is at risk of being automated. So there's this weird thing that's going on. Having said that, I think it's sort of important to take stock of, even if their jobs are not risk, even if they do not recognize that their jobs are being at risk of automation, that does not sort of prevent them from feeling that there's an element of decline or a fear of decline. I think that's the core message that both Bruno and I were trying to get at. And one of the things is that, I mean, for various reasons. One, it's also the nature of the fact that many of these people tend to also have lost out from other shocks before. So globalization, migration, so on and so forth. That's the first thing. The second thing that's also crucial is that one need not be able to identify the risk to be able to fear a sense of decline. And I think a crucial element over here is also how social status comes into it, in the sense of how we accord the value to these jobs. So objectively speaking, you might not be in economic decline, but just a simple idea of, I mean, just take the simple example of Sunderland, right? What does it mean to be in manufacturing today? In 1970s, I was in manufacturing, and hypothetically speaking, I'm saying anecdotally here, right? My dad was in manufacturing, my granddad was in manufacturing. The idea that there is sort of a community built around manufacturing and something to be proud of. Today, if you say that you're from manufacturing and someone is from London, they probably would go like, oh, you know, manufacturing, like, you know, that's something of like a passé, right? That's a long time ago. So the kind of status accordance that Maria Yahoda has spoke about is still relevant over here. And it's also something that Michel Lamont speaks a fair bit about. I think that that's very important to speak of. Then that actually ties to the second part of your question, which is about, so what are they blaming, right? Like, so what are they talking about? Curiously, I think this is a part of work that I did with one of my colleagues, and we showed that many of these people whose jobs are at risk of automation, globalization, and automation and globalization, so three categories of people, they actually often view immigrants suspiciously. So, which makes it a very effective movement for the radical, it benefits the radical right. They can't identify what is affecting them. They feel that, but yet at the same time, they're sort of more anti-immigrant for various reasons. We don't know what it is. We sort of, right? So net of their income, net of their sort of occupational and other things, they tend to be a little bit more anti-immigrant. So there's a problem there. So that allows a sort of misattribution game to be played at by political parties. And that's something that I think that has come out in, I think it was in a 2022 publication by, I can't remember her first name, by Wu. Basically, she stated that there's a huge element of misattribution going on. And to the final level, about macro level, so that's interesting. A lot of our measures over here. So if you look at automation literature, there are two types of measures, three types actually. One, the subjective individual level measure at the occupational level. Two, the occupational level measures being at RTI, so the routine task intensity index at the task level, or at ANS et al., which is also a task level, or at the occupational level, which is basically the free and score. Then you have another level, which is more of sort of a meso or even a macro level, which is basically robot exposure. And that's what basically Anelli and colleagues did in the 2022 piece. And basically the results are fairly similar. In places where there's greater robot exposure, so higher density of robots, there tend to be an increase in support for radical parties, including the radical right. So it plays out in multiple ways. And again, sort of interestingly, it also maps over the entire China shock sort of theory that's going on. I mean, the results for the China shock. Very, very often, and one of the key things I think is that because if you go to David Autor's I think one of David Autor's China shock images, and you look at the industries, and so I'm now taking sort of an industrial perspective, so a sectoral perspective, the sectors that are affected by automation and the sectors that are affected by trade are often quite similar. And so you see a fairly similar mapping across at the macro level. So, sorry, long story short, I hope that those sort of covered your questions.
So in my story, I forgot to mention Joe Biden, and I think he gives one potential example of what I mean about bringing the workers next to the New York educated middle class and some rich people into the fore. I think that Biden really got the message that the workers, the lower middle class, were attracted by Trump. You remember his campaign going with trade unions, going there and saying, I'm like you, I'm speaking with you, and he brought them back. So I don't know what you think. You probably know better than me, but just he had something here, and if you look at the IRA plan, it's really to bring some jobs for these people and bring some pride back to manufacturing industry, to refer to what Jen just said. But pride because you contribute to environmental change and adaptation rather than just being victim of, and we have a job there. The question about unions. I don't know if you know Niccolò Durazzo's work, or also David Natali's work, but these people who are from Italy and are also interested in what happens in Italy, and they show something really interesting. When I was working on dualization, Italy was really the place where trade unions, and on pension, trade unions were pro-insiders. You know, in the late 90s, early 2000s, really Italian unions on the shrinking side, they were really pro-insiders, you know, defending, being even ready to give up with women's working services. They cannot unionize them anyway. But they were going so far in shrinking to be threatened from just disappearing, as manufacturing industry was, that they have changed strategy. And this is true for CGT in France too. They have started to try to unionize service workers, those having no papers, those working in hotel and retail, etc., and having a much more universalistic views. Nowadays, what you see in Italy is that if you look at the central trade union's position, it's much more egalitarian, universalist than the German ones, and even the Swedish ones, who are split, you know, between various ones. IG Metall is still awfully pro-insiders and doesn't care anything about Verdi, women, etc. Whereas Italy, so that's interesting story. I would say, I'm not saying we have hope there, but let me finish on the third thing, is that Zhen reminded us that these workers, these lower middle class, are suspicious about migrants. Okay, and we know that there may be some points for that, you know, the reserve army in a way, those kind of things. But there is also a story told by radical right and a few radical left, actually, like Aufstellen, which is migrants are a threat for you. But actually, if you look at what is really the core preoccupation of the lower middle class, it seems to be much more what is happening at work than what migrants are making to you guys. And I've been working recently on a doctoral student here, Paulus Wagner, who has done something pretty simple. He has been studying, observing two villages, one in former East Germany and one in Austria. So these are villages where you have a lot of workers, working class workers, almost no unemployment and no migrants, and still a very, very high rate of vote for AfD in Germany and FPÖ in Austria. And he's been observing, interviewing them, etc. And they keep speaking about the workplace. And they are fed up to be considered as a number, you know, just an adjustment, never being able to have a say, to have at least a feedback, you know, on the production process, etc. You know, the feeling that they are just here to be adjusted, not acknowledged, not recognized. And he has made a strong correlation using Eurobarometer. Felix, you were referring to that. And this is what he finds. The more you have bad workplace relationship, you feel that, you say that, the more you are likely to vote for radical right. So this is quite a strong correlation. To my view, this is an interesting explanation of what is happening today. And by the way, don't remember, there are strikes going on in Germany. There are trade unions in UK. I don't know if you realize what this sentence means, but I've been trained in hearing that Margaret Thatcher had killed the trade unions. And apparently they are revived. They are able to organize strikes. And you have also refusal of some labor market condition in the US, the quiet quitting, and you have demonstration in France against the pension reforms, which forced them to work more, 2 more years. The workers nowadays are able to protest because demography changes, because the condition provided by COVID Israel give them some reflection, and you have a change now. So it's not sure, but at least the left, if it dare to speak about the workplace, working condition, work organization, management, and these kind of things, could have a chance to speak to this lower middle class who's suffering at work more than anything else, you know, suffering from migrants and these kind of things.
That's great, thank you. I see we have a question from Jana in the chat. I know that the issue about Japan you've been discussing, but there was an earlier point as well. I wondered if you wanted to put that to Bruno now.
Thanks, Rachel. Bruno, really good to see you after so many years. Thank you both for your presentation, but I really wanted to bring us back to your initial question. But I'm far more interested in not in why people aren't voting for the radical left, because I think I know that, but why aren't they going for major right? So what's pushing them towards the radical part of that spectrum? Thank you.
I'm not really sure, but this is one of the main findings of our paper with Zhen, is that if there is a kind of YouTube mechanism, you know, the more and the less, this is much more between major right and radical right than between the left and the right. Actually, this is what the graphs are showing. I would suspect it's because the major right is really unable to speak about the lower middle class, because they are the defenders of progress, economic progress, technology. They are the defenders of globalization. You know, not only the winners and taking, you know, winning out of it, but defending it. You know, promoting and these kind of things. And it's only when they start to contest globalization, Europe, and this kind of thing that they try to reattract them. And this is what you've seen in UK, what you've seen in the US. And then the problem is that this major right becomes radical right. You know, if you think of Trump at least, and I wouldn't dare to speak about Johnson in front of a British audience, but I suspect it's the same kind of move in a way. So this is my hunch, but I guess that Jen knows more about the precise mechanisms.
I mean, to hop on, I think that's an interesting point. I think that there are multiple ways to think about it. I think the first one is sort of the data issue. I think this is to 2016, right? 2012 to 2016. This predates Trump. This predates a lot of where the right has shifted, the sort of center right has shifted a little bit more towards the radical right. So I think I'll preface with that statement. I think the second is also to ask compositionally, who are these people whose jobs are at risk of automation? A huge number of them tend to be from the manufacturing class, and also some of them are service sector workers. Then the next question is, do these people traditionally vote for the major rights? They often do not. So that's why, you know, they are, first of all, unlikely to vote for the major right. Then the second condition comes in that I think the major right often does not offer the kind of message that works in their favor or probably speaks to their interests. So on one hand, I think Bruno has alluded to that, like it's also sort of a sociocultural image, right? That they don't basically, they're sort of defending progress, defending immigrants. I think, and again, I want to preface that this predates sort of the more rightist turn of many of the center-right parties. I think the second thing is also to notice that this is also the period of sort of post-austerity sort of thing, where a lot of the center-rights were also very hard on the welfare state, were also hard on the economic, on sort of the, you know, the economic livelihoods of these people. So on the both grounds, I think that made them rather unattractive to basically to these people. But having said that, what you see today might be a bit different, right? Like in terms of what exactly what Bruno has been speaking about in terms of what Theresa May and the Jams, where they're able to reach out to these people again. So I think it's a very dynamic process. We're not saying that the major right, it's a foregone conclusion. I think that in our analysis needs to be looked at within that specific context. But I think that the core message remains that these people, it depends on which political party is willing to speak to their interests, or to put it in Bruno's terms, if they speak to the right ear, to pander to their interests. So it depends on which way and which party does.
Brilliant. Thanks both. We are slightly over time. Apologies for that, but I think we'll need to wrap it up there. Thank you everybody for joining us. Before we leave, can I just say one last final thank you for Bruno and Zhen for some really interesting research and presentations today, and I'm sure we'll be hearing a lot more about that in the future. And also to draw your attention to the next Digit debate, which is on the 21st of June, from algorithmic fairness to algorithmic robustness and back. And please do register for that. And we hope to see you soon. Thanks for joining us.